Every parent knows the moment when their child makes a decision that changes everything forever. In 1887, 8-year-old Wynona walked into that dusty auction house in Cedar Ridge, clutching her family's savings, about to bid on something that would shake the very foundation of the Old West. The crowd watched in stunned silence as this Apache girl raised her small hand to claim the largest eagle anyone had ever seen. WíyakA was no ordinary bird. With wings that seemed to stretch beyond nature itself, the great eagle carried ancient legends and sacred power. When Wynona's bid of $47 won the auction, settlers whispered of curses while her people saw the return of a guardian spirit. The question that haunted everyone that day was simple. What could drive a child to risk her family's entire future for this mysterious creature? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Apache camp, nestled in the valley of Whispering Pines, where Wynona's family had made their home for 3 generations. The air carried the scent of juniper smoke and the distant sound of her grandmother's voice, weaving stories that danced between memory and prophecy. Wynona sat cross-legged beside the fire pit, her small fingers tracing patterns in the red earth, while her grandmother Nyarit prepared the sacred herbs that would fill her medicine pouch, a beaded leather treasure passed down through countless seasons of change. Child of 2 worlds, Nyarit whispered, her weathered hands sorting dried sage and cedar with practiced care. Your dreams have been restless again, haven't they? Wynona nodded, her dark eyes reflecting wisdom that seemed too old for her 8 years. For weeks now, the same vision had visited her sleep. A great eagle with wings that blotted out the sun, circling high above the sacred mountains where her ancestors once hunted buffalo. In her dreams, she could feel the wind beneath those magnificent feathers, could hear an ancient song that spoke of protection and sacrifice. The medicine pouch, crafted from deer hide and decorated with turquoise beads that caught the morning light, lay open between them. Inside, generations of Apache medicine women had collected the sacred elements that connected their people to the spirit world. White sage for purification, cedar bark for prayers, red clay from the sacred mountain, and small stones worn smooth by time and faith. Each ingredient carried the power of ancestral wisdom. But lately, Nyarit had sensed something changing in the spiritual currents that flowed around their camp. Tell me about the eagle dream again, her grandmother said, settling her ancient bones onto the worn blanket beside Wynona. It's always the same, grandmother. The great bird circles our mountains, but it's crying, a sound that breaks my heart. It searches for something it has lost, and I can feel its loneliness like a weight in my chest. Then it looks at me with eyes that seem to know my name, and I wake up with tears on my face. Nyarit's expression grew thoughtful as she tied the medicine pouch closed with strips of soft leather. The beadwork told the story of their family line, each pattern representing a different generation of healers and visionaries who had guided their people through times of plenty and seasons of hardship. Now, as the world around them shifted like desert sand in a windstorm, the old woman wondered if her granddaughter might be the one chosen to carry their sacred traditions into an uncertain future. The camp itself reflected the delicate balance their people maintained between ancient ways and the demands of a changing world. Traditional tipis stood alongside more permanent structures built from adobe and timber, their walls decorated with both sacred symbols and practical tools needed for daily survival. Children played games that their great-grandparents had enjoyed, while adults discussed the challenges of maintaining their cultural identity in a territory increasingly dominated by settlers and government officials who understood little about Apache traditions. Wynona's father, Nantan, worked as a scout for the territorial government, a position that provided necessary income for their family, but sometimes put him at odds with more traditional tribal members who viewed any cooperation with white authorities as betrayal. Her mother, Itzela, wove baskets and blankets that she sold in Cedar Ridge, using her artistic skills to bridge the gap between two cultures while keeping ancient patterns and techniques alive. The financial pressures facing their family were not unique among the Apache people of 1887. Government policies had systematically reduced their territory and limited their traditional means of survival. Hunting grounds that had sustained their ancestors for countless generations were now divided by fences and claimed by ranchers who had little understanding of the sacred relationship between the Apache and the land they called home. Many families faced impossible choices between preserving their cultural identity and adapting to economic realities that demanded integration into the settlers' world. "The white soldiers came through yesterday," Nantan said, approaching the fire with the measured gait of a man carrying invisible burdens. His weathered face bore the marks of someone who spent long days under the desert sun, but his eyes still held the quick intelligence that made him valuable as a scout. "They speak of new surveys, new boundaries. The territorial governor wants to meet with our leaders next month." Wynona listened to the adult conversation while pretending to focus on her morning chores, understanding more than her parents realized about the complex political forces that shaped their daily lives. She had inherited her grandmother's gift for reading the subtle currents of emotion and intention that flowed beneath spoken words, and she could sense the deep worry that her father tried to hide behind practical concerns. Cedar Ridge, the nearest settlement to their camp, had grown from a frontier outpost into a bustling town of nearly 800 souls in less than a decade. The discovery of silver in the nearby mountains had attracted prospectors, merchants, and opportunists from across the territory, creating a community that buzzed with economic activity but often crackled with cultural tension. Apache families like Wynona's navigated this environment with careful diplomacy, trading their skills and goods for the supplies they needed while maintaining the respectful distance that helped prevent most conflicts. The town's main street featured a general store, a blacksmith shop, 2 saloons, a small church, and the territorial courthouse where government officials conducted the legal business that affected everyone in the region. On market days, Apache women would set up blankets displaying their weavings and pottery alongside Mexican vendors selling spices and vegetables, while miners and ranchers conducted the business that drove the local economy. It was in this complex environment that Wynona had first heard whispers about the traveling auction that would soon arrive in Cedar Ridge. Exotic animals, captured from far corners of the American frontier and beyond, would be displayed and sold to the highest bidders. Such events were rare spectacles that drew curious crowds from miles around, offering entertainment and the chance to witness creatures that existed at the very edges of the known world. "Why would anyone capture a spirit eagle?" Wynona asked her grandmother one evening as they watched the stars emerge above their valley. Nayarit was quiet for a long time, her fingers working steadily at the traditional beadwork that kept her hands busy while her mind wandered through decades of accumulated wisdom. "Some people see power as something to be owned rather than respected, child. They believe that by caging a wild creature, they can possess its strength. But the spirits cannot be truly imprisoned. They wait for the right moment, the right person, to reclaim their freedom." The medicine pouch rested in Wynona's lap, its weight somehow both comforting and significant. Inside, she could feel the small objects that connected her to generations of Apache women who had faced their own times of uncertainty and change. Each bead, each sacred stone, carried the prayers and hopes of ancestors who had survived wars, droughts, and the constant pressure of a world that seemed determined to erase their way of life. As the auction date approached, Wynona found her dreams becoming more vivid and urgent. The great eagle in her visions seemed to be calling to her across vast distances, its cries becoming more desperate with each passing night. She began to understand that her family's small savings, $47, carefully accumulated through months of her mother's weaving and her father's scouting wages, might somehow be connected to the destiny that seemed to be approaching like a storm gathering strength on the horizon. The evening before the auction, Wynona sat with her family around their cooking fire, watching the flames dance while her grandmother prepared a special blessing ceremony. The medicine pouch would travel with them to Cedar Ridge, carrying the protection and guidance of their ancestors into whatever challenges awaited. As Nayarit spoke the ancient words that had been passed down through countless generations, Wynona felt a sense of purpose settling over her like a warm blanket. "Tomorrow will test all of us," the old woman said, her voice carrying the weight of prophecy. "But remember, child, sometimes the smallest hands are chosen to carry the greatest responsibilities. The spirits will guide you, but you must be brave enough to listen to their wisdom." Looking back years later, Wynona would remember that night as the last moment of her childhood innocence, the final evening when her biggest concerns were helping with daily chores and listening to her grandmother's stories. By the following sunset, she would be forever changed, bound to a destiny that would challenge everything she thought she knew about courage, sacrifice, and the mysterious forces that connect all living things in an endless web of purpose and meaning. The iron shackles around WíyakA's legs gleamed with an otherworldly sheen that made Wynona's skin crawl the moment she laid eyes on them. These were no ordinary restraints. The metal had been forged with strange symbols that seemed to pulse with a dark energy, and even from across the crowded auction yard, she could feel the malevolent power they radiated. The great eagle sat motionless in a reinforced cage that dwarfed every other enclosure, her magnificent form somehow diminished by the cruel bonds that held her to a thick wooden perch. But it was WíyakA's eyes that stopped Wynona's heart. Those ancient knowing orbs held depths of wisdom and sorrow that no wild creature should possess. When their gazes met across the dusty space filled with chattering spectators and exotic animals, Wynona felt something fundamental shift in her understanding of the world. This was not simply a large bird captured for human entertainment. This was a being of immense spiritual power, trapped and suffering in ways that transcended physical imprisonment. The traveling auction had transformed Cedar Ridge's main street into a carnival atmosphere that buzzed with excitement and whispered rumors. Cages and pens lined the thoroughfare, containing creatures that most frontier residents had never imagined. A mountain lion with a coat like liquid gold, parrots whose feathers blazed with tropical colors, and a black bear that paced restlessly while curious onlookers maintained respectful distances. But WíyakA commanded attention in ways that dwarfed every other attraction. "Sweet Mary and Joseph," breathed Mrs. Henderson, the general store owner's wife, as she clutched her husband's arm. "That wingspan has to be 8 feet if it's an inch. I've never seen its like." "Unnatural, if you ask me," muttered old Pete Garrison, spitting tobacco juice into the dust. "Ain't no eagle supposed to be that size. Mark my words, that thing's cursed." Wynona moved through the crowd like a sleepwalker, drawn by forces she couldn't name toward the massive cage that held WíyakA captive. Her grandmother's medicine pouch bounced gently against her hip with each step, the sacred objects inside seeming to hum with recognition of the spiritual energy that radiated from the imprisoned eagle. Other spectators gave the cage a wide berth, some crossing themselves or muttering protective prayers, but Wynona felt no fear, only a growing sense of destiny unfolding. The auctioneer, a portly man named Augustus Cromwell, who traveled the frontier, circuit with his collection of exotic specimens, was busy organizing his ledgers and preparing for the afternoon's sale. He had purchased WíyakA from a trapper who claimed to have captured her in the sacred mountains north of Apache territory. A story that made Wynona's blood run cold as she realized this magnificent creature had been stolen from the very lands her people considered holy. "Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls," Cromwell called out in his practiced carnival barker's voice, "prepare yourselves for the most extraordinary auction west of the Mississippi River. We have assembled creatures from every corner of this great continent, including specimens that defy the natural order itself." When his gesture directed the crowd's attention to WíyakA's cage, a collective gasp arose from the assembled spectators. Even hardened miners and weathered ranchers seemed awed by the eagle's presence, though few could articulate the spiritual weight that pressed down upon anyone who looked directly into those ancient eyes. "This magnificent bird of prey," Cromwell continued, his voice taking on the rhythm of a practiced salesman, "was captured in the remote wilderness of the Northern Territories. Expert naturalists have confirmed that no known species of eagle achieves such proportions, leading to speculation that we may have here a remnant of prehistoric times, a living fossil that has survived in the most isolated regions of our continent." Wynona knew better. This was no prehistoric survivor or genetic anomaly. WíyakA was a spirit eagle, one of the sacred guardians that her grandmother's stories described as bridges between the physical and spiritual worlds. Such beings appeared in Apache legends as protectors and guides, manifesting during times of great change or danger to offer wisdom and strength to those chosen to receive their gifts. The bidding began with modest offers from curious settlers who saw WíyakA as an exotic conversation piece for their homes or businesses. $5, then $10. As the auctioneer worked to generate enthusiasm among potential buyers. A well-dressed merchant from Phoenix bid $15, envisioning the crowds WíyakA might draw to his establishment. A retired cavalry officer offered $20, thinking such a magnificent creature would make an impressive addition to his ranch. But as the bidding progressed, Wynona felt WíyakA's eyes upon her with increasing intensity. The eagle had remained motionless throughout the proceedings, showing no reaction to the human voices discussing her fate like a piece of property. Now, however, her great head turned with deliberate purpose to focus entirely on the small Apache girl who stood at the edge of the crowd with tears streaming down her face. The moment their gazes locked, Wynona heard something impossible. WíyakA's voice speaking directly into her mind without sound or words. The communication transcended language, flowing like warm water through her consciousness and carrying meanings that her 8-year-old vocabulary couldn't express, but her spirit understood completely. "Little sister," the voice was ancient and infinitely patient. "I have waited so long to find you." Wynona's hand moved instinctively to the medicine pouch at her hip, feeling the sacred objects inside respond to WíyakA's presence with gentle warmth. Her grandmother had prepared her for many things, but nothing could have readied her for this moment of direct spiritual contact with a being whose existence bridged worlds. "The iron hurts," WíyakA continued, her mental voice carrying undertones of pain that made Wynona's chest tighten with sympathy, but not as much as the separation from home, from purpose. "I allowed myself to be captured because the spirits showed me a vision of a child who would understand." The bidding had reached $35, with only 2 serious contenders remaining. The Phoenix merchant and a stern-faced man in an expensive suit who had arrived on the morning train from Tucson. Wynona realized with growing desperation that her family's entire savings amounted to exactly $47, money that was supposed to last them through the winter months ahead. "I have money," Wynona projected the thought toward WíyakA, with all the intensity she could muster, unsure if the eagle could hear her mental voice as clearly as she heard WíyakA's. "I know, little sister, but are you prepared for what will come after? Once you claim me, both our lives will change in ways you cannot imagine. There will be danger, sorrow, and choices that will test everything you believe about courage and sacrifice." $38. called the merchant, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool morning air. $40, countered the man from Tucson, his voice calm and confident. Wynona stepped forward, her small hand raised high above the crowd. $47, she called out in a voice that carried surprising strength despite her youth. The auction ground fell silent, except for the distant sound of horses shifting restlessly at the hitching posts. Every eye turned toward the small Apache girl who had just offered more money than many adults in the crowd had ever seen at one time. Whispers began to ripple through the spectators, some questioning whether a child could possibly have such an amount, others expressing shock that an Indian girl would dare bid against respectable white men. "Young lady," Cromwell said, his practiced smile wavering as he processed this unexpected development, "I'm afraid I'll need to see proof of your ability to pay before I can accept your bid." Wynona reached into the small leather satchel her mother had given her, withdrawing the precious collection of coins and bills that represented months of her family's careful saving. The money felt heavy in her small hands, not from its physical weight, but from the sacrifice it represented and the leap of faith she was about to take. The man from Tucson studied her with calculating eyes before raising his hand again. $50, he said smoothly. Wynona's heart sank as she realized her resources had been exhausted. She looked toward WíyakA's cage with desperation, meeting those ancient eyes one final time. What she saw there changed everything. Not resignation or defeat, but a patient confidence that suggested the outcome of this auction had been determined by forces far beyond the simple exchange of money. "I'm afraid that exceeds my resources," Wynona said quietly, her dignity intact despite her disappointment. But before the auctioneer could declare the bidding closed, something extraordinary happened. The man from Tucson doubled over suddenly, clutching his stomach and making sounds of distress that drew concerned murmurs from nearby spectators. The Phoenix merchant began coughing violently, his face turning an alarming shade of red as he struggled to catch his breath. Within moments, both men had withdrawn from the bidding, claiming sudden illness and retreating to seek medical attention. "Well, then," Cromwell said, his eyes darting nervously between the departing bidders and the eerily calm eagle in her cage, "it appears we have a winner. $47 to the young lady." As Wynona approached WíyakA's cage with her payment, she could feel the weight of dozens of stares upon her back. Some faces showed curiosity, others suspicion or outright hostility, but none of that mattered. Now, she had claimed her destiny, and WíyakA had accepted her as a chosen guardian. "Now our real journey begins, little sister," WíyakA's voice whispered in her mind as the iron shackles were unlocked. "Are you ready to discover what it truly means to fly?" The ancient feather map spread across Nayarit's weathered blanket told stories that predated written history, each carefully preserved plume arranged in patterns that revealed the sacred geography of Apache spiritual traditions. Wynona had seen the map only twice before in her young life, during ceremonies so important that even children understood the gravity of the moments. Now, 3 days after bringing WíyakA home to their valley, her grandmother had unrolled the precious collection, with hands that trembled slightly from age and anticipation. "See how each feather points toward a place of power," Nayarit explained, her voice carrying the weight of generations of accumulated wisdom. "Eagle feathers for the sky, places where spirits dwell. Hawk feathers for the mountain passes where visions come. Owl feathers for the hidden caves where our ancestors stored their most sacred objects." WíyakA perched quietly in the makeshift enclosure that Nantan had constructed from pine logs and rawhide rope, her magnificent presence transforming their humble family camp into something that felt charged with otherworldly energy. The iron shackles had left raw wounds on her powerful legs, and despite Wynona's gentle ministrations with healing herbs, the eagle remained still and watchful, eating only when absolutely necessary, and speaking to no one but the young girl who had claimed her freedom. "The pattern is changing," Nayarit continued, her fingers hovering over feathers that seemed to shift positions on their own, rearranging themselves into configurations that had never before appeared in the centuries-old map. New paths are opening, but old ones are closing forever. Your WíyakA carries power that reaches far beyond what our people have ever encountered. Wynona knelt beside her grandmother, studying the feather map with the intensity of a student learning lessons that might someday save her life. The eagle feathers, ancient specimens passed down through countless generations of medicine women, now pointed toward locations that formed a perfect circle around the sacred mountain where WíyakA had been captured. The patterns suggested a spiritual boundary, a protected area that the great eagle had been guarding before her imprisonment. "Why won't she eat properly?" Wynona asked, glancing toward WíyakA with concern that had been growing stronger each day. "I've offered her fresh rabbit, prairie dog, even the trout that father caught yesterday. She takes just enough to survive, but nothing more." Nyarit's expression grew troubled as she considered the question. In her 73 years of life, she had learned to read the subtle signs that preceded significant spiritual events, and WíyakA's behavior suggested deep mourning that transcended simple homesickness or adjustment to captivity. "Grief," the old woman said finally. "WíyakA mourns for something precious that was taken from her. Until she can reclaim what was lost or find a way to honor its memory, her spirit will remain fractured." The truth of her grandmother's words resonated in Wynona's chest like the echo of thunder in canyon walls. Through their growing psychic connection, she had begun to sense fragments of WíyakA's emotions, waves of loss so profound that they sometimes left the young girl gasping for breath. But the eagle's pain remained largely mysterious, communicated in images and sensations that Wynona's limited experience couldn't fully interpret. Outside their family camp, the reaction to WíyakA's presence had created ripples of tension that spread through both the Apache community and the settler population of Cedar Ridge, like wildfire jumping from tree to tree. Some Apache elders viewed the eagle's arrival as a sign of changing times that might bring either great fortune or terrible calamity to their people. Settlers whispered about curses and omens, their conversations growing more heated as stories of WíyakA's supernatural behavior spread through the territory. The Reverend Patterson preached against her on Sunday, Itzela reported, as she returned from selling baskets in town, her usually cheerful demeanor clouded by worry. Called her an instrument of heathen magic that poses a danger to Christian souls. Some of the townspeople are organizing a petition to have her removed from the territory. Nantan set down the harness he had been mending and looked toward WíyakA's enclosure with the expression of a man calculating odds in a dangerous game. His position as a government scout required him to maintain good relations with territorial authorities, but his love for his daughter and respect for spiritual traditions created competing loyalties that grew more difficult to balance with each passing day. "There's talk of new regulations," he said carefully. "Laws governing the ownership of exotic animals, especially those that might pose threats to public safety. The territorial governor has received reports about unusual weather patterns coinciding with WíyakA's arrival, storms that form out of clear skies, wind patterns that make no sense to experienced trackers." Wynona felt her heart sink as she realized the growing scope of opposition they faced. It was one thing to deal with curious neighbors or skeptical relatives, but quite another to confront organized political forces backed by legal authority and religious fervor. WíyakA seemed to sense her distress, turning her great head toward the young girl with eyes that held infinite patience and surprising gentleness. "Do not fear them, little sister," the eagle's voice whispered in her mind. "Those who oppose us are driven by ignorance, not true malice. They sense power they cannot understand and react with the fear of children lost in darkness. She speaks to you, doesn't she?" Nyarit asked, her voice soft with wonder rather than surprise. Wynona nodded, no longer trying to hide the supernatural connection that grew stronger each day. Her grandmother had always been able to sense spiritual currents that remained invisible to others, and attempting deception would be both impossible and disrespectful. What does she tell you about her life before the capture? Fragments mostly, images of flying above the sacred mountain, watching over places where her people, her kind, had nested for countless generations. But there's something else, something that causes her great pain when she tries to share it with me. That evening, as the family gathered around their cooking fire for the simple meal of cornbread and beans that had become their standard fare, WíyakA did something unprecedented. She left her perch and walked slowly toward the fire, her movements deliberate and filled with ceremonial gravity. The family watched in silent amazement as the great eagle positioned herself directly opposite Wynona across the flames, then began to speak in a voice that resonated not through their ears, but directly into their souls. The communication that followed transcended language, flowing through their consciousness like warm honey mixed with starlight. WíyakA shared fragments of her true nature, not simply a large bird or even a spirit eagle, but a guardian whose responsibilities encompassed the protection of sacred places and the maintenance of spiritual balance across vast territories. She had been born in the time of their great-great-grandmothers, when the sacred mountain still rang with the songs of her kind, and the spiritual boundaries between worlds remained strong and clearly defined. For decades, she had watched over the holy places where Apache ancestors had left their prayers and visions, ensuring that the ancient wisdom remained accessible to those who knew how to listen. But something had begun to change in recent years. The spiritual barriers that protected sacred sites had started weakening as more settlers arrived in the territory, their presence disrupting energy patterns that had remained stable for centuries. WíyakA had been forced to range farther from her traditional territory, seeking ways to reinforce the failing protections through her own life force and determination. It was during one of these extended journeys that the trappers had found her, weakened by the constant expenditure of energy required to maintain spiritual boundaries. The iron shackles they used had been forged specifically to bind creatures of supernatural power, their metal infused with symbols and intentions designed to cut WíyakA off from the sources of her strength. "But now I have found you," she concluded, her mental voice carrying warmth that made tears spring to Wynona's eyes. "The spirits showed me a vision of a child who could serve as an anchor, a connection to the human world that would allow me to protect both our peoples from the chaos that approaches." As the fire burned down to glowing coals and the desert stars emerged overhead, Wynona felt the weight of destiny settling around her shoulders like a blanket woven from starlight and responsibility. She was no longer simply a young Apache girl trying to care for an extraordinary pet. She had become a bridge between worlds, chosen to help maintain the spiritual balance that kept both her people and the settlers' communities safe from forces they couldn't understand. The question that haunted her as she drifted towards sleep was whether an 8-year-old girl and a wounded spirit eagle would prove strong enough to face whatever challenges the future might hold. The trader's ledger that Wynona discovered hidden beneath a loose floorboard in the abandoned cabin told a story that made her stomach turn with revulsion and her heart burn with righteous anger. The worn leather book, its pages yellowed with age and stained with what looked suspiciously like dried blood, contained meticulous records of Cornelius Blackwood's illegal animal trafficking operations spanning nearly 2 decades across the American frontier. She had been following WíyakA on their first tentative flight together, a magical experience that had left her breathless with wonder as she soared above the valley on the eagle's broad back, when the great bird had suddenly changed course and descended toward the ruins of an old trapper's cabin that had been abandoned for years. Something in WíyakA's behavior, the way her powerful body had tensed with recognition and grief, told Wynona that this place held significance beyond its appearance as just another frontier relic. The cabin itself showed signs of hasty abandonment. Overturned furniture, scattered belongings, and windows broken from the inside as if someone had fought desperately to escape. But it was the hidden compartment that WíyakA's supernatural senses had detected that revealed the true horror of what had transpired in this seemingly innocent location. Blackwood's handwriting was precise and coldly methodical as he documented his crimes with the detached efficiency of a businessman recording routine transactions. April 15th, 1885, captured adult female spirit eagle from sacred nesting grounds north of Apache territory. Subject showed extreme resistance to iron restraints, suggesting supernatural properties confirmed by tribal sources. Estimated value, $200, $300 to private collector. Wynona's hands shook as she turned the pages, each entry revealing another violation of the natural world and sacred traditions that her people held dear. Blackwood had not been simply an opportunistic animal trader. He had been deliberately targeting creatures of spiritual significance, using knowledge gained from corrupt sources to locate and capture beings that served as guardians and bridges. Between Worlds, May 3rd, 1885. Subject refuses all food, shows signs of severe depression following separation from offspring. Note: young eagles abandoned in nest likely perished without maternal care. Consider more efficient capture methods for future operations. The words hit Wynona like physical blows as she realized the full extent of WíyakA's loss. The great eagle had not merely been stolen from her territory, she had been torn away from her children, leaving them to die alone and afraid in their mountain nest. The grief that WíyakA carried was not abstract spiritual sorrow, but the devastating pain of a mother who had failed to protect her young. WíyakA, Wynona projected the thought with all the gentle compassion she could muster. I understand now. I'm so sorry. The eagle's response came not in words, but in a flood of images that overwhelmed Wynona's young mind with their intensity. She saw WíyakA's nest hidden in a crevice high on the sacred mountain's face, carefully constructed from pine branches and lined with soft grasses gathered from hidden meadows. Two eaglets, their down still fluffy with youth, their beaks opening trustingly as their mother returned from hunting expeditions that took her farther and farther from home as she struggled to find enough food in territory increasingly disrupted by human activity. The trappers had come at dawn, using nets and ropes to cut off WíyakA's escape routes while she was returning with fresh fish for her hungry children. The iron shackles had been waiting, forged specifically for creatures of supernatural power, their metal inscribed with symbols designed to sever spiritual connections and drain mystical strength. By the time WíyakA had broken free from the nets and fought her way past the trappers' crude snares, the shackles had already begun their work, leaving her too weak to return to her nest before Blackwood's men transported her to the auction circuit. 3 days, WíyakA's mental voice carried anguish that made tears stream down Wynona's face. My children survived 3 days alone before the mountain cold claimed them. I felt their life force fade while I sat in that iron cage, unable to break free, unable to save them. The ledger contained more than just records of individual captures. It revealed a systematic campaign to weaken the spiritual protections that kept the frontier in balance. Blackwood had been working with corrupt government officials and unscrupulous settlers to identify and eliminate the mystical guardians that various native tribes relied upon for protection and guidance. His ultimate goal appeared to be the complete subjugation of indigenous spiritual traditions, clearing the way for unrestricted exploitation of sacred lands and resources. December 12th, 1886, received confirmation that Apache sacred sites contain significant mineral deposits. Removal of spiritual guardians proceeding according to plan. Territorial governor has agreed to support new legislation restricting native religious practices in exchange for mining rights to protected areas. Wynona felt sick as she realized the scope of the conspiracy that had torn WíyakA from her children and threatened to destroy the spiritual foundation of her people's way of life. This was not random cruelty or simple greed. It was a calculated attack on the sacred bonds that connected Apache communities to their ancestral wisdom and the land that had sustained them for countless generations. But the ledger also contained information that gave her hope. Blackwood's record showed that several other spirit guardians had escaped his traps or been rescued by tribal warriors before they could be sold at auction. A great wolf whose howl could summon storms, a mountain lion whose presence blessed hunting parties with supernatural success, and even a wise raven whose prophecies had guided Apache leaders through previous crises, all had evaded Blackwood's nets and remained free to protect their territories. "We are not alone in this fight," WíyakA observed as Wynona shared what she had learned from the ledger. "But we must be careful. Blackwood's failure to deliver me to his buyers has made him desperate, and desperate men make dangerous enemies." As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of approaching horses echoed across the valley, their hoofbeats creating a rhythm that made both Wynona and WíyakA tense with alarm. Through the cabin's broken windows, they could see a group of riders approaching their family's camp, men in expensive suits and territorial badges, accompanied by local settlers whose faces wore expressions of grim determination. "Hide the ledger," WíyakA instructed urgently. "This evidence must not fall into their hands until we understand exactly who can be trusted with its secrets." Wynona tucked the leather book inside her shirt, feeling its weight against her ribs like a piece of her heart that had been torn free and sewn back in place with threads of sorrow and determination. The knowledge it contained had transformed her understanding of WíyakA's pain, but it had also revealed the true scope of the challenges they would face in the days ahead. As they prepared to return to camp and confront whatever new crisis awaited them, Wynona felt the first stirrings of a resolve that would have surprised adults who saw her only as a small Apache girl with an unusual pet. She was beginning to understand that her bond with WíyakA carried responsibilities that extended far beyond the simple care of an exotic bird. She had become a guardian herself, chosen to help protect not just her own people, but the spiritual balance that kept their entire world from falling into chaos. The men waiting at their camp would soon learn that they were not dealing with a confused child and a captured animal, but with two beings whose destinies had become intertwined in ways that would reshape the future of the territory they all called home. The ceremonial pigments that Nayarit mixed with WíyakA's naturally shed feathers created patterns on Wynona's face that seemed to glow with inner light as the ancient Apache coming-of-age ritual reached its mystical climax. Each color carried meaning that had been passed down through generations of medicine women. Red clay from the sacred mountain for courage, white chalk from hidden caves for wisdom, yellow ochre from desert flowers for the connection between earth and sky, and finally, the deep blue-black created when WíyakA's feathers dissolved into the sacred paint, like starlight melting into midnight. "You are no longer a child tonight," Nayarit whispered as she applied the final touches to the intricate design that transformed Wynona's young face into a living representation of spiritual power. "The spirits have chosen you to walk between worlds, to serve as a bridge connecting all peoples to the sacred forces that keep our existence in balance." Wynona sat perfectly still in the center of the ceremonial circle, feeling the weight of transformation settling into her bones like warm honey infused with lightning. Around her, the most respected elders of their community had gathered to witness this unprecedented ritual, a coming-of-age ceremony for an 8-year-old child whose spiritual gifts had manifested years earlier than anyone had thought possible. WíyakA, perched at the eastern edge of the circle, her magnificent presence lending power to the ancient words and sacred smoke that rose from Nayarit's carefully tended fire. The great eagle's eyes reflected the dancing flames, while her consciousness reached out to touch Wynona's awareness with gentle guidance, preparing the young girl for the vision quest that would complete her initiation into the mysteries that few adults ever experienced. "Close your eyes, granddaughter," Nyarit instructed, her voice taking on the rhythmic cadence that preceded deep spiritual work. "Let WíyakA's spirit guide you to the place where past, present, and future converge into truth." The world dissolved around Wynona like smoke dispersing in wind, as her consciousness rose above her physical form and soared through dimensions that existed beyond the reach of ordinary human perception. She found herself flying alongside WíyakA through skies that sparkled with possibilities, their shared awareness expanding to encompass vast territories and countless lifetimes of accumulated wisdom. Below them, the landscape shifted and changed, like pages turning in an enormous book written by time itself. She saw her ancestors' villages from centuries past, thriving communities that lived in harmony with natural forces and spiritual guides who moved freely between the worlds of matter and magic. She witnessed the first arrival of Spanish explorers, then American settlers, watching how each wave of newcomers disrupted ancient patterns of balance and cooperation. But it was the visions of approaching conflict that made Wynona's spirit recoil with horror and determination. She saw armies gathering on both sides of cultural divides, men who had allowed fear and misunderstanding to poison their hearts against neighbors who shared the same hopes for peace and prosperity. Government officials in distant offices making decisions based on reports filed by corrupt agents who profited from chaos and division. Sacred sites being violated by mining operations that cared nothing for the spiritual significance of the places they destroyed. "This is what comes if we fail." WíyakA's voice resonated through the vision with the weight of absolute certainty. "But look closer, little sister. See the threads of possibility that offer hope for a different future." Wynona focused her attention on the golden streams of light that wove through even the darkest visions, revealing moments when understanding bridged the gaps between cultures and wisdom triumphed over ignorance. She saw herself as a grown woman, standing before tribal councils and government assemblies with WíyakA at her side, speaking words that helped others recognize the sacred bonds connecting all living beings. She witnessed sympathetic settlers working alongside Apache families to protect sites of spiritual significance, their cooperation creating new traditions that honored both cultures while preserving the ancient wisdom that kept their communities safe. She saw children of mixed heritage growing up with feet firmly planted in two worlds, carrying forward the best traditions of both while creating innovations that neither culture could have achieved alone. "These possibilities exist," WíyakA explained, "but they require sacrifice and courage from those chosen to serve as bridges. Are you prepared to accept such a path, knowing that it will demand everything you have to give?" In her vision, Wynona felt herself aging rapidly through the years that would follow her acceptance of this calling. She experienced the weight of adult responsibilities settling onto shoulders that had once carried only the simple concerns of childhood. She felt the pain of losses that would test her faith and the joy of victories that would affirm her purpose. Most significantly, she experienced the deep satisfaction that comes from a life spent in service to something greater than personal comfort or safety. "I accept," she projected the thought, with all the conviction her young spirit could muster. "Show me what I need to learn." The visions that followed provided her with knowledge that would prove essential in the trials ahead. She learned to recognize the signs that preceded spiritual attacks on sacred sites, understanding how corrupted individuals could use stolen ceremonial objects to disrupt the energy patterns that protected important locations. She gained insight into the motivations driving both her enemies and potential allies, seeing past surface appearances to the fears and hopes that shaped their actions. Most importantly, She discovered that her connection with WíyakA had awakened, latent abilities that had been passed down through her family's bloodline for generations. Like her grandmother and great-grandmother before her, she possessed the gift of spiritual sight that allowed her to perceive the invisible forces that influenced human behavior and natural events. With WíyakA's guidance, these abilities would grow stronger as she matured, eventually enabling her to serve as a true medicine woman for her people. When she finally returned to ordinary consciousness, Wynona found herself surrounded by faces that reflected awe and concern in equal measure. The sacred war paint on her cheeks had changed during her vision quest, its colors now shifting and flowing like living aurora borealis that captured and reflected the spiritual energies she had encountered during her journey between worlds. "The spirits have marked you as one of their own," observed Joseph Running Bear, the eldest member of their tribal council. "But such gifts come with burdens that would challenge warriors twice your age. Are you certain you understand what you have accepted?" Wynona rose to her feet, with movements that seemed to carry new grace and purpose, her young body somehow transformed by the wisdom she had gained during her mystical journey. When she spoke, her voice carried harmonics that reminded the gathered elders of wind singing through sacred canyons and water flowing over ancient stones. "I understand that understanding itself will be my greatest challenge," she replied with mature insight that startled even Nayarit. "But WíyakA has shown me that some paths must be walked regardless of their difficulty, because the alternatives lead to endings that no one who loves life could accept." As the ceremony concluded and the gathered witnesses began to disperse, Wynona felt the full weight of her transformation settling into place like armor, forged from starlight and tempered with tears. She was still 8 years old in body, but her spirit now carried the accumulated wisdom of generations and the sacred responsibility to protect both her own people and their neighbors from the darkness that gathered strength in the shadows of misunderstanding and greed. The approaching storm of conflict that her visions had revealed would test every lesson she had learned and every ability she had gained. But she no longer faced the future as a confused child clinging to an exotic pet. She had become a true guardian, chosen by forces beyond human comprehension to help preserve the delicate balance that kept their world from tumbling into chaos. The treaty document that Lieutenant Marcus Webb brought to Wynona's attention bore all the official seals and signatures that territorial law required. But when WíyakA's image began appearing in the margins, like ghostly watermarks, visible only in certain light, both the young Apache girl and the troubled cavalry officer realized they were examining something far more sinister than routine government paperwork. Webb had been assigned to the Cedar Ridge Territorial Office only 6 months earlier. His pristine military record and genuine desire to serve with honor, making him an unwelcome presence among the corrupt officials who profited from the systematic exploitation of native lands and resources. When he discovered the fraudulent treaty hidden among supposedly legitimate documents in the territorial governor's private files, his sense of duty had compelled him to seek out someone who could help him understand the full implications of what he had found. "I've seen enough genuine treaties to recognize the differences," Webb explained, as he spread the document across Wynona's family's dining table, his weathered hands betraying the nervous tension that contradicted his calm professional demeanor. "The language is too convenient, the terms too one-sided, and the Apache signatures, forgive me for being blunt, appear to have been traced from other documents rather than signed by actual tribal representatives." Wynona studied the parchment. With eyes that had been trained by her recent spiritual transformation to perceive layers of meaning that remained invisible to ordinary sight. The fraudulent treaty proposed to transfer nearly 50,000 acres of sacred Apache territory to private mining interests, offering in exchange a handful of goods and services that represented perhaps 1% of the land's actual value. But more disturbing than the unfair terms was the document's fundamental disregard for the spiritual significance of the areas it sought to claim. "These are the places where our ancestors are buried," she said quietly, her finger tracing the boundaries marked on the crude map attached to the treaty. "The sacred springs where our medicine women have gathered healing plants for over 200 years. The mountain caves where our war leaders sought visions that guided our people through times of crisis." As she spoke, WíyakA's image continued to manifest in the document's margins with increasing clarity and detail. What had begun as barely visible marks resembling water stains gradually resolved into precise illustrations of the great eagle in flight. Her wings spread in protective postures over the very locations that the treaty sought to transfer to private ownership. "Have you ever seen anything like this before?" Webb asked, his voice carrying the controlled alarm of a rational man confronting a phenomena that challenged his understanding of natural law. "My grandmother told stories about documents that were touched by spiritual forces when great deceptions threatened sacred places," Wynona replied, remembering Nayarit's teachings about the ways that the spirit world sometimes intervened to reveal hidden truths. She said that lies powerful enough to cause widespread suffering would sometimes call forth warnings that even those who rejected Apache wisdom could not ignore. Webb leaned closer to examine WíyakA's ghostly image, his trained eye noting details that confirmed his growing suspicions about the document's authenticity. "Look at the precision of these illustrations. No human hand could have drawn them directly onto parchment with this level of detail, especially not with whatever substance is creating these marks. They appear to be forming themselves as we watch." The supernatural manifestation was indeed continuing to evolve, with new elements appearing every few minutes, as if WíyakA's consciousness was using the fraudulent treaty as a canvas for communicating urgent warnings about the dangers it represented. Around the eagle's primary image, smaller symbols began to emerge. Apache pictographs indicating sacred sites, warning signs that spoke of spiritual pollution, and protective wards designed to prevent harm from reaching the places they guarded. "There's something else," Webb continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper as he pulled additional documents from his saddlebags. "I found correspondence between Territorial Governor Hamilton and several investors back east, including someone who signs his letters C. Blackwood. They're planning to use this treaty as justification for mining operations that would completely destroy the spiritual sites your people consider most sacred." Wynona felt her blood chill as she recognized the name that had haunted her nightmares since discovering the trader's ledger. Cornelius Blackwood was not merely an animal trafficker working alone. He was part of a conspiracy that included some of the territory's highest-ranking officials, all of them united in their determination to eliminate Apache spiritual traditions that stood in the way of their profit-seeking schemes. "The corruption runs deeper than we imagined," WíyakA's voice whispered in her mind, carrying undertones of sadness that reflected the great eagle's growing understanding of human capacity. "For betrayal and greed, but this young soldier offers hope. His spirit remains clean, despite the pollution that surrounds him." "Lieutenant Webb," Wynona said carefully, testing her intuition about the man's character before revealing information that could prove dangerous if shared with the wrong person. "If I told you that there are forces at work here that go beyond simple political corruption, spiritual forces that most people would dismiss as superstition, would you be willing to listen with an open mind?" Webb was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving between the supernatural images continuing to manifest on the treaty document and the serious expression on the face of the 8-year-old girl who spoke with the gravity of someone much older. "And more experienced, Miss Wynona," he said finally. "I've spent enough time on the frontier to learn that dismissing local wisdom usually leads to trouble that could have been avoided through respectful attention. If you and your people possess knowledge that could help prevent injustice, I'm prepared to listen, regardless of whether it fits within the narrow categories that my military training taught me to accept." His response confirmed Wynona's growing sense that Lieutenant Webb might prove to be a crucial ally in the struggles ahead. Unlike many soldiers and government officials who viewed native spiritual traditions as primitive superstitions to be overcome or eliminated, Webb demonstrated the intellectual humility necessary for true understanding between cultures. WíyakA, my eagle, is not simply an unusually large bird, Wynona began, choosing her words carefully to convey essential truths without overwhelming Webb with information he might not be ready to accept. She is a spiritual guardian whose presence helps maintain the balance that keeps this territory safe for everyone who lives here, regardless of their cultural background. The people trying to destroy Apache sacred sites don't understand that. They're threatening protections that benefit their own communities as well as ours. As if responding to Wynona's explanation, WíyakA herself emerged from the family's lodge and approached the table, where the fraudulent treaty lay spread like evidence of humanity's capacity for self-destructive greed. The great eagle's presence immediately intensified the supernatural activity affecting the document, causing new images to appear with startling rapidity and clarity. Webb watched in amazement as the parchment transformed before his eyes, its margins filling with detailed maps that showed the spiritual energy patterns connecting sacred sites across hundreds of miles of territory. The images revealed how mining operations at key locations would disrupt protections that had prevented natural disasters, tribal conflicts, and economic instability for generations. "Dear God," Webb whispered, as the full implications became clear to him. "They're not just stealing land, they're destroying the very forces that keep this region from falling into chaos." Wynona nodded gravely, feeling the weight of adult responsibility settling more firmly onto her young shoulders, as she realized that their small group had become the guardians of knowledge that could determine the fate of thousands of people, both native and settler alike. "Now you understand why WíyakA's freedom is about more than one girl's attachment to an unusual pet," she said. "We're all connected in ways that most people never realize, and those connections require protection from those who would break them for personal profit." The obsidian mirror that Nyarit carefully unwrapped from its protective deerskin covering had been hidden in the deepest recesses of the family's most sacred storage cave for over a century, waiting for the moment when its revelations would be needed to guide a chosen descendant through trials that would determine the fate of their people. The polished volcanic glass reflected light in ways that seemed to bend reality itself, creating depths that extended far beyond the mirror's physical thickness and revealing truths that existed beyond the reach of ordinary human perception. Great-great-grandmother Ayana carved this mirror from stone that fell from the sky during the year of 3 eclipses, Nyarit explained, as she positioned the sacred object on a blanket woven with protective symbols. She knew that someday one of her descendants would need to see past the veils that hide the true nature of spiritual connections, and she prepared this tool to serve as a window between worlds when that time arrived. Wynona approached the spirit mirror with reverence that had been deepened by her recent coming-of-age ceremony and the growing awareness of her role as a bridge between the human and spiritual realms. WíyakA perched nearby, her magnificent presence adding power to the ancient ritual, while her consciousness reached out to support and guide her young human companion through whatever revelations awaited. As Wynona gazed into the obsidian surface, the reflection that gazed back at her began to change in ways that made her heart race with anticipation and growing amazement. Her own young face dissolved like mist, replaced by the weathered features of a woman she had never seen, but somehow recognized at the deepest level of her being, a face marked by wisdom and determination, framed by long silver hair and eyes that held depths of compassion earned through a lifetime of service to others. "Ayana," Nayarit whispered, her voice carrying reverence that spoke of family legends passed down through generations of women who had served as keepers of spiritual traditions. "Your great-great-grandmother, the most powerful medicine woman our people had ever known." But as Wynona continued to gaze into the mirror, the image shifted again, revealing something that transformed her understanding of everything she thought she knew about herself, her family, and her connection to WíyakA. The face of Ayana gradually dissolved into the form of a great eagle, not just any eagle, but WíyakA herself, her ancient eyes holding the same compassion and wisdom that had characterized the human medicine woman. "I don't understand," Wynona whispered, her voice trembling with confusion and growing wonder as the implications began to penetrate her consciousness. "How can WíyakA be? Look deeper, little sister." WíyakA's mental voice carried patience and love that transcended the boundaries between species and lifetimes. "See the truth that connects all things in an endless cycle of service and transformation." The spirit mirror's surface rippled like water disturbed by wind, revealing a sequence of images that told a story spanning over a century of Apache history and spiritual evolution. Wynona saw Ayana in her prime, a woman whose supernatural abilities had made her legendary among both native peoples and the first wave of settlers who had learned to respect her wisdom and healing powers. She witnessed the growing conflicts that had marked Ayana's later years, as gold prospectors and land speculators brought violence and spiritual pollution to territories that had remained sacred and protected for countless generations. She saw her great-great-grandmother making the ultimate sacrifice, choosing to give up her human form and transform into a spirit eagle so that she could continue protecting the sacred sites and guiding her people through the dark times that lay ahead. "When my human body could no longer contain the power needed to maintain the spiritual barriers that protected our people," WíyakA's voice explained as the visions continued to unfold, "I chose to accept transformation rather than abandon my responsibilities. For over 60 years, I have watched over the sacred places as an eagle, waiting for the moment when I would find a descendant strong enough to share the burden of guardianship." The mirror showed Wynona the moment of WíyakA's capture by Blackwood's trappers, revealing that the great eagle had not been taken by surprise or overcome by superior force. She had deliberately allowed herself to be imprisoned because her spiritual sight had shown her a vision of the auction where her chosen successor would be waiting. "I knew that only through apparent defeat could I reach you," WíyakA continued. "The spirits showed me that my great-great-granddaughter would be the one to claim my freedom and accept the inheritance that I had been protecting for her throughout all the years of my transformed existence." Wynona felt tears streaming down her face as she realized the profound depth of the sacrifice that WíyakA, Ayana, had made to ensure that their family's spiritual gifts would survive the challenges that threatened to destroy Apache traditions entirely. Her great-great-grandmother had given up not only her human life, but also the simple pleasures of family relationships and community connections, spending decades in eagle form so that her descendants would inherit both the power and the wisdom needed to navigate the complex world they had been born into. "The auction was never about chance or coincidence," Wynona whispered as the full scope of WíyakA's plan became clear to her. "You arranged everything, the capture, the timing, even my family having exactly the right amount of money to win. The bidding, the spirits guided events, but human free will remained paramount," WíyakA replied. "You could have chosen safety over courage, could have allowed fear to prevent you from claiming your destiny. The money your parents had saved was exactly $47. Because that was the amount that would test your family's faith while remaining within their means. But the choice to risk everything for a creature you barely understood had to come from your own heart." The spirit mirror revealed another shocking truth that recontextualized everything Wynona had learned about Cornelius Blackwood and the conspiracy threatening Apache sacred sites. The obsidian surface showed images of Blackwood's ancestors from over a century earlier. The same gold prospectors and land speculators whose greed and violence had ultimately forced Wynona to sacrifice her human form in order to maintain the spiritual protections that kept their territory in balance. The pattern repeats across generations, WíyakA explained, as the mirror displayed a complex web of family connections linking past and present conflicts. Blackwood's great-great-grandfather was the man who led the first organized attacks on our sacred sites, believing that destroying our spiritual traditions would eliminate Apache resistance to his mining operations. Now his descendant follows the same path, using more sophisticated methods but driven by identical motivations. So this isn't just about territorial disputes or cultural differences, Wynona said, as understanding dawned in her mind like sunrise breaking over the sacred mountain. It's about two family lineages whose destinies have been intertwined for generations, one dedicated to protecting spiritual balance, the other determined to destroy it for material gain. The mirror's final revelation showed Wynona herself as she would appear in years to come, grown into the full power of her inherited abilities and working alongside WíyakA to maintain the delicate balance that kept their world from falling into chaos. She saw herself speaking to councils of both Apache and settler leaders, helping them understand the connections that linked all their communities in an invisible web of mutual dependence and shared responsibility. But the visions also revealed the trials that lay immediately ahead, the final confrontation with Blackwood and his allies that would determine whether the spiritual protections that Wynona had died to preserve would survive into the next generation, or whether the forces of greed and ignorance would finally succeed in shattering the sacred bonds that had maintained peace and prosperity throughout the territory. Are you prepared to accept this inheritance, knowing what it will cost you? WíyakA asked, her mental voice carrying the weight of all the sacrifices that had led to this moment. Wynona looked up from the spirit mirror to meet WíyakA's ancient eyes, eyes that held her great-great-grandmother's love and wisdom transformed, but not diminished by decades spent in eagle form. She felt the full weight of 4 generations of spiritual responsibility settling onto her shoulders, like a mantle woven from starlight and tempered with tears of both sorrow and joy. "I accept," she said simply, her young voice carrying conviction that would have impressed adults who had spent lifetimes learning to face their fears with courage and determination. "Show me what we need to do." As the spirit mirror's surface returned to its normal reflective state, Wynona felt the transformation completing itself within her consciousness. She was no longer simply a young Apache girl who had formed an extraordinary bond with a mystical creature. She had become the latest link in a chain of guardians whose dedication to protecting the sacred balance would determine the fate of everyone who called the territory home, regardless of their cultural background or personal beliefs about the invisible forces that connected all living things in an endless web of mutual dependence and shared destiny. The ancient thunder drum that emerged from the hidden cave system beneath the sacred mountain carried the accumulated power of 2 centuries worth of Apache ceremonies, its elkide surface marked with symbols that seemed to shift and dance in the flickering light of Nayarit's torch. The massive instrument had not been removed from its resting place since the time of Wynonna's transformation, waiting through decades of silence for the moment when its voice would once again call the spirits of the land to witness a confrontation that would determine the spiritual fate of the entire territory. 4 generations of our people have added their prayers to this drum, Nayarit explained, as she and Wynona carefully maneuvered the sacred instrument through narrow passages that wound deep into the mountain's heart. Your great-great-grandmother, Wynona, blessed it with her own blood before her transformation, and the spirits of every Apache warrior who died defending our sacred places have contributed their strength to its power. Wynona felt the drum's energy pulsing through her hands as they worked together to transport it to the surface, each beat of its invisible heart sending vibrations through her body that awakened spiritual abilities she was still learning to understand and control. WíyakA circled overhead, her magnificent form creating protective patterns in the sky, while her consciousness reached out to touch the ancient powers that slumbered within the mountain's depths, stirring them to wakefulness in preparation for the battle that approached like a storm gathering strength on the horizon. The past 3 days had brought a convergence of forces that transformed the quiet valley where Wynona's family made their home into the focal point for conflicts that had been building across multiple generations. Government troops under the command of Territorial Governor Hamilton had established a camp 5 miles to the east, their official mission the enforcement of the fraudulent treaty that would strip the Apache people of their most sacred lands. Cornelius Blackwood had arrived with hired mercenaries and mining equipment, his presence lending a sense of urgent threat to the political maneuvering that masked deeper spiritual warfare. But the Apache had not remained passive in the face of these mounting challenges. Runner Braves had carried word to tribal communities across hundreds of miles, calling forth warriors and spiritual leaders who understood that the approaching conflict would determine whether their ancient traditions would survive into the next generation or be swept away by forces that recognized no value beyond immediate material profit. The response had been extraordinary. Chiefs who had not spoken to each other in years set aside old grievances to unite against the common threat. Medicine men emerged from hidden retreats where they had preserved sacred knowledge through decades of cultural suppression. Even young warriors who had been tempted by the promise of easier lives in the settlers' world returned to stand with their people when they understood the true scope of what they faced. Among the arriving allies, none impressed Wynona more than Joseph Two Hawks, a warrior only 3 years older than herself, who had already earned recognition for his courage in defending Apache hunting parties from hostile raiders. His arrival at their camp had been marked by ceremony and celebration, but Wynona found herself drawn to the quiet intelligence she saw in his dark eyes and the respectful way he spoke to the elders who gathered around the thunder drum. "The spirits have been restless in my dreams," Joseph confided to Wynona as they worked together to prepare the sacred war paint that would mark all participants in the coming ceremony. "I see visions of a great eagle whose wings span the entire territory, protecting places that my grandfather once described as windows between worlds." Wynona felt her heart flutter with emotions that her 8-year-old mind could barely comprehend as she recognized the spiritual sensitivity that made Joseph different from other young warriors who relied purely on physical courage and combat skills. WíyakA had shown her glimpses of potential futures where she and Joseph would work together as partners in maintaining the sacred balance, their combined abilities creating protections that neither could achieve alone. "He carries the bloodline of the Stormcallers," WíyakA observed as she watched the young warrior demonstrate his skill with the traditional weapons that would be needed in the physical aspects of the approaching battle. His ancestors could speak to thunder and lightning, calling down the sky's power to aid their people in times of great need. With proper training, he could become a formidable ally. The thunder drum's placement at the exact center of their defensive preparations required knowledge that had been passed down through generations of Apache spiritual leaders who understood the invisible currents of power that flowed beneath the surface of the physical world. The mountain itself served as a natural amplifier for mystical energies, its network of caves and underground streams creating resonance patterns that could carry ceremonial vibrations across vast distances. When the drum finally stood ready in the sacred circle, that Wynona and the other elders had carefully constructed according to traditions that predated written history. Its presence immediately began attracting supernatural attention from throughout the territory. Birds arrived in unprecedented numbers, circling overhead in complex patterns that spoke of spiritual forces gathering for a cosmic confrontation. The wind began carrying sounds that seemed to originate from impossible distances, war chants from long-dead warriors, the voices of spirit animals offering their protection, and beneath it all, the deep harmonies that connected every sacred. Sight in an invisible web of mutual support, Lieutenant Webb had arrived the previous evening with information that confirmed everyone's worst fears about the scope of the conspiracy they faced. Governor Hamilton had received authorization from Washington to use military force in implementing the fraudulent treaty, while Blackwood's financial backers had provided him with enough resources to hire professional gunmen whose reputations for ruthlessness preceded them throughout the frontier. They're planning to begin mining operations immediately after taking control of the sacred sites, Webb reported to the Council of Apache leaders who had gathered to coordinate their response. Blackwood believes that destroying the physical locations will automatically eliminate whatever spiritual protections your people have established, leaving the territory vulnerable to unlimited exploitation. He doesn't understand the true nature of what he's attacking, Wynona replied, her aged voice carrying certainty that came from a lifetime spent studying the mysteries that connected all living things. The sacred sites are not simply physical locations. They are anchors that hold spiritual energy in patterns that protect everyone in this territory, regardless of their cultural background. Destroying them would unleash chaos that would consume both our communities and theirs. The final preparations for the Thunder Drum ceremony required the participation of every spiritual leader who had answered the call to defend their sacred traditions. As sunset approached on what might be the last peaceful evening the territory would experience for generations, Wynona found herself at the center of a gathering that represented the accumulated wisdom and power of Apache spiritual traditions stretching back to the very origins of their people. The ceremony began with the lighting of 4 sacred fires positioned at the cardinal directions around the thunder drum, each flame carrying prayers and protective intentions that rose toward the darkening sky like visible manifestations of hope and determination. The drummers who would call forth the ancient powers took their positions with reverence that reflected their understanding of the forces they were about to awaken. "Are you ready for what comes next?" WíyakA asked as she perched beside the thunder drum, her magnificent form seeming to glow with inner light that reflected the spiritual energy building around them. Wynona nodded, feeling the weight of her inherited responsibilities settling more firmly onto her shoulders as she prepared to serve as a conduit for powers that had slept within her bloodline for generations. The sacred war paint on her face had been mixed with drops of WíyakA's blood and her own, creating a connection that would allow her to channel abilities that no single human could safely contain alone. As the first thunderous beats of the ancient drum rolled across the valley like the footsteps of giants walking between worlds, Wynona felt her consciousness expanding to encompass awareness of every living thing within hundreds of miles. She could sense the approaching enemies, with their hearts full of greed and violence, but she could also feel the presence of potential allies among the settlers, people whose basic decency would lead them to oppose injustice once they understood what was truly at stake. The thunder drum's voice carried across the territory like a supernatural alarm clock, awakening forces that had slumbered peacefully for decades, while the delicate balance between cultures had held firm. Spirit animals began emerging from hidden places where they had waited for this moment, their forms becoming visible to ordinary human sight as the boundaries between worlds grew thin. Ancient warriors materialized in the spaces between firelight and shadow, their ghostly forms adding strength to the living defenders who would face the coming battle. But most significantly, the thunder drum's power reached out to touch the hearts of everyone within its range, flooding their consciousness. With direct understanding of the connections that linked all their lives in an invisible web of mutual dependence. Even Blackwood's hired gunmen found their dreams invaded by visions that showed them the consequences of their intended actions, while government soldiers began questioning orders that suddenly seemed designed to serve private interests rather than public good. As the ceremonial night deepened toward dawn, Wynona realized that the thunder drum had accomplished something beyond calling supernatural forces to their aid. It had created a moment of spiritual awakening that would force everyone in the territory to choose between the path of cooperation that led toward peace and prosperity, or the road of domination that promised only temporary victory, followed by inevitable destruction. The final confrontation would begin within hours, but its outcome would be determined not by superior weapons or tactical advantages, but by the choices that individual human beings made when forced to confront the true nature of the forces that shaped their shared destiny. The thunder drum had awakened more than ancient powers. It had stirred the conscience of an entire territory, creating possibilities for resolution that had not existed before its voice rang out across the land like a call to spiritual arms. The weapon that materialized in Wynona's hands as the first rays of dawn broke over the sacred mountain defied every natural law that governed the physical world. Its shaft forged from lightning that WíyakA had called down from storm clouds that gathered with supernatural speed above the battlefield. The lightning spear pulsed with electrical energy that made the air around it shimmer with heat distortion, while its crystalline point blazed with light that seemed to capture and concentrate the spiritual power that flowed through every sacred site in the territory. Governor Hamilton's troops had begun their advance under cover of darkness, their movements coordinated with Blackwood's mercenaries in a pincer attack designed to overwhelm the Apache defenders through superior numbers and firepower. But they had not anticipated the spiritual forces that rose to meet them as the thunder drum's echoes continued reverberating across the valley like the heartbeat of the mountain itself. Now we show them the true meaning of power. WíyakA's voice resonated through Wynona's consciousness as the great eagle spread her magnificent wings and launched herself into the sky, her form seeming to grow larger and more luminous as she channeled the accumulated energy of generations of Apache spiritual traditions. Wynona felt her own awareness expanding as she took flight alongside her transformed great-great-grandmother, the lightning spear enabling her to soar through the air as if gravity had become merely a suggestion rather than an immutable law. Below them, the sacred valley erupted into a battlefield unlike anything the American frontier had ever witnessed, where supernatural forces clashed with human ambition in a confrontation that would determine the spiritual fate of an entire territory. The government soldiers, trained for conventional warfare against human opponents, found themselves facing phenomena that challenged their understanding of reality itself. Apache warriors seemed to multiply in number as the spirits of their ancestors joined the battle, ghostly figures wielding weapons that could strike physical targets while remaining immune to bullets and bayonets. The very landscape appeared to be fighting against the invaders, with rocks and trees moving of their own accord to create obstacles and defensive positions. Blackwood's mercenaries, hardened by years of violence across multiple territories, discovered that their reputations for ruthlessness meant nothing when confronted by forces that transcended the purely physical realm. Their weapons misfired or jammed at crucial moments, their horses refused to advance toward the sacred sites, and their leaders found their tactical plans disrupted by weather phenomena that appeared and disappeared according to no natural pattern. But it was WíyakA's weather manipulation that proved most decisive in the early phases of the battle. The great eagle's presence in the sky seemed to serve as a focal point for atmospheric energies that had been building for days, calling forth lightning strikes that targeted enemy positions with supernatural precision while leaving the Apache defenders completely unharmed. The lightning spear in Wynona's hands served as both weapon and conductor, allowing her to direct the electrical discharges that WíyakA summoned from the storm clouds that continued gathering strength overhead. Each bolt that she guided toward enemy positions carried more than simple destructive force. It delivered spiritual energy that overwhelmed hostile intentions and replaced them with sudden clarity about the true nature of the conflict. My God! Lieutenant Webb breathed as he witnessed soldiers under his nominal command laying down their weapons and backing away from the sacred sites they had been ordered to seize. They're not being harmed, they're being enlightened. The young cavalry officer had positioned himself at the boundary between the opposing forces, his conscience preventing him from participating in an attack he knew to be unjust, while his military training made it impossible for him to openly rebel against superior orders. Now he found himself serving as an unofficial mediator as government soldiers began refusing to advance against defenders whose cause they suddenly understood and respected. Joseph Two Hawks fought with skills that seemed to combine traditional Apache warrior techniques with supernatural abilities inherited from his Stormcaller ancestors. Lightning crackled around his weapons as he moved through the battlefield, his presence inspiring other young warriors, while his spiritual gifts allowed him to coordinate defensive maneuvers with the ghostly ancestors who had answered the thunder. Drums call. The turning point came when Wynona and WíyakA, working in perfect harmony, created a spectacular display of aerial combat that left both sides staring in awe at the sky above the valley. The great eagle's wings seemed to span the entire battlefield as she wove patterns of flight that channeled lightning into protective barriers around the sacred sites, while Wynona used the lightning spear to direct energy precisely where it was needed to disable hostile forces without causing unnecessary casualties. Blackwood himself, watching from a position he had believed to be safely distant from the actual fighting, found his command post surrounded by spiritual manifestations that made continuing the attack impossible. Ancient Apache shamans materialized around his position, their ghostly forms radiating disapproval and supernatural authority that caused even his most ruthless mercenaries to flee in terror. "Fall back!" Governor Hamilton shouted as he realized that his forces were not retreating in defeat, but transforming into potential allies of the very people they had been sent to suppress. "This is not a battle we can win through conventional means." As the government troops and Blackwood's remaining mercenaries withdrew to regroup and reconsider their options, the first phase of the climactic confrontation concluded with a victory that felt more like a spiritual awakening than a military triumph. The lightning spear dissolved back into pure energy as Wynona and WíyakA descended to rejoin their allies, their supernatural demonstration having achieved something that seemed impossible just hours earlier. They had turned enemies into potential friends through the simple expedient of revealing truth. The heartstone that formed from WíyakA's tears as she prepared to make the ultimate sacrifice glowed with crystalline light that seemed to contain all the colors of sunset and dawn combined into a single radiant gem. Wynona caught the precious object as it fell from her great-great-grandmother's eagle eyes, feeling its warmth pulse against her palm like a second heart filled with love so pure that it made her own spirit ache with the beauty and sorrow of the moment. Blackwood had returned at midday, with reinforcements that included military artillery and mining equipment designed to physically destroy the sacred sites, even if spiritual protections could not be overcome through conventional force. His alliance with corrupt government officials, had provided him with resources that transformed the conflict from a battle for hearts and minds into a desperate fight for the survival of the spiritual foundations that had maintained peace and prosperity throughout the territory for countless generations. If we cannot possess the power of these places, then we will ensure that no one else can benefit from their protection, Blackwood declared, as his men positioned cannons that would reduce the sacred mountain's key sites to rubble and dust. The age of superstition ends today, and the era of progress and profit begins. WíyakA perched on the highest peak of the sacred mountain, her magnificent form silhouetted against storm clouds that gathered with unnatural speed and intensity. As she prepared to channel every particle of her accumulated spiritual energy into a protective barrier that would endure for generations. The transformation that had sustained her for over 60 years in eagle form had always been intended as a temporary measure, a way of preserving her power until a suitable successor could be found and trained. Little sister, her mental voice, carried infinite tenderness as she communicated with Wynona for what both of them knew would be the final time. The moment has come for me to complete the sacrifice that I began when I chose transformation over death. Are you ready to carry forward the traditions that have protected our people through so many trials? Wynona felt tears streaming down her face as she realized the full magnitude of what WíyakA, Ayana, was preparing to do. The great eagle would surrender her remaining life force to create a permanent spiritual barrier around all the sacred sites in the territory, ensuring that no human agency could ever again threaten the balance that kept their world stable and secure. There has to be another way, Wynona whispered, her young voice breaking with emotion as she contemplated losing the guide and companion who had transformed her understanding of her own purpose and potential. We've already shown them that they cannot win through violence. Surely they will listen to reason now. But even as she spoke, Blackwood's artillery opened fire on the sacred sites with explosive shells designed to shatter stone and obliterate any physical structures that might serve as focal points for spiritual energy. The bombardment that followed shook the mountain itself, sending rock slides cascading down slopes where Apache ancestors had walked in peace for centuries. Some people choose destruction even when offered the path to understanding, WíyakA replied, as she began to glow with inner light that made her visible even in the bright afternoon sun. But their choices need not determine the fate of everyone who calls this territory home. Watch carefully, Wynona. What you are about to witness will guide you through all the challenges that await in the years to come. The great eagle spread, her wings one final time, her form expanding until she seemed to encompass the entire sky above the sacred valley. Light poured from her feathers like liquid starlight, creating patterns in the air that spoke of protection, love, and sacrifice beyond the power of human language to express. The heartstone in Wynona's hands grew warm as it responded to WíyakA's transformation, serving as a conduit that allowed the young girl to channel her own inherited abilities in support of her great-great-grandmother's ultimate gift. The spiritual barrier that formed around the sacred sites manifested as a dome of crystalline light that rose from the mountain's base to heights that seemed to brush the clouds themselves. Blackwood's artillery shells struck the barrier and simply dissolved into harmless sparks, while his mining equipment ceased to function as the supernatural energies disrupted their mechanical operations. Remember me not as the eagle who flew above your world, WíyakA's voice whispered through the heartstone as her physical form began to dissolve into pure light, but as the love that connects all generations of our family in an unbroken chain of service and dedication. The power I leave with you will grow stronger with each passing year, and someday you will train your own successor to carry our traditions into a future that neither of us can fully imagine. As WíyakA's transformation reached completion, the protective barrier around the sacred sites solidified into a permanent feature of the spiritual landscape that would endure for centuries to come. No force on Earth would ever again be able to threaten the places where Apache ancestors had stored their wisdom and power, while the energy patterns that maintained regional stability would continue functioning regardless of political changes or cultural conflicts. Wynona stood holding the Heartstone, feeling the weight of her inheritance settling into her bones as she realized that she had become the sole guardian of traditions that now extended their protection over both native and settler communities alike. The little Apache girl, who had bid on an eagle at auction, had grown into a young woman whose responsibilities encompassed the spiritual welfare of thousands of people who would never fully understand the forces that kept their world safe and prosperous. The barrier's completion marked not just the end of Blackwood's threat, but the beginning of a new age where the wisdom of the past would guide the territory's development toward a future built on cooperation rather than domination, understanding rather than fear, and love rather than the endless hunger for profit that had driven men like Blackwood to attempt the destruction of everything sacred and beautiful in the world. The pendant that hung around Wynona's neck 6 months after the final battle contained a fragment of the Heartstone that WíyakA had left as her ultimate gift, its crystalline surface reflecting light in ways that reminded everyone who saw it of the spiritual forces that protected their territory with invisible but unmistakable power. Now 15 years old in wisdom, though still 8 in body, Wynona had grown into her role as the guardian of traditions that served both Apache and settler communities with equal dedication and care. The sacred sites remained protected by the luminous barrier that could be seen shimmering above the mountain peaks on clear mornings, its presence serving as a constant reminder that some things in the world transcended the petty concerns of politics and profit. Visitors came from across the territory and beyond to witness the phenomenon that had no scientific explanation but needed none, since its effects on the spiritual well-being of everyone in the region spoke for themselves with unmistakable clarity. The fraudulent treaty had been officially overturned following an investigation that Lieutenant Webb had initiated using evidence from Blackwood's ledger and the supernatural manifestations that had convinced even skeptical government officials that forces beyond their understanding were at work in the territory. The new agreements that replaced the corrupt document established the sacred sites as protected areas under joint Apache and territorial jurisdiction, creating a precedent for cooperation that would influence policy throughout the American frontier. Cornelius. Blackwood himself had disappeared during the chaos of the final battle, his criminal network exposed and dismantled by authorities who could no longer ignore the evidence of his illegal activities. Some claimed he had fled to Mexico to avoid prosecution, while others whispered that he had been driven mad by the spiritual forces he had encountered and was wandering the desert as a broken man who spoke only of eagles that haunted his dreams. The progressive alliance between Apache leaders and sympathetic settlers had grown stronger in the months following the conflict, with both communities working together to establish new traditions that honored the wisdom of the past while adapting to the realities of a changing world. Children of both cultures learned each other's languages and customs, creating bonds of understanding that would prevent future conflicts while preserving the unique gifts that each tradition brought to their shared homeland. Lieutenant Webb had resigned his military commission to become an advocate for native rights in the territorial capital, his experiences during the battle having convinced him that his true calling lay in building bridges between cultures rather than enforcing policies that served narrow interests at the expense of the common good. His regular visits to the Sacred Valley had become occasions for discussing the legal and political frameworks needed to protect spiritual traditions while allowing for economic development that benefited everyone in the territory. Joseph, too. Hawks had remained close to Wynona throughout the months of adjustment and healing that followed WíyakA's sacrifice, his own spiritual gifts developing under her guidance as they worked together to understand the full scope of their inherited responsibilities. Their partnership had evolved into something that promised to become the foundation for a new generation of guardians who would carry forward the traditions of protection and service that had kept their world in balance through so many trials. The children are ready for their first lesson about the spirit animals, Joseph observed as he approached the grove where Wynona conducted her teaching sessions for the young people of both cultures who had shown signs of inherited spiritual abilities. I've never seen them so eager to learn about traditions that their parents barely understood existed. Wynona smiled as she watched the mixed group of Apache and settler children gathering around the ancient oak tree where she shared the stories and practical knowledge that would prepare them to serve as bridges between the physical and spiritual worlds. Each child carried the potential to develop gifts that would serve their entire community, but more importantly, they represented hope for a future where cooperation and mutual respect would be the natural order rather than remarkable exceptions. The guardian's necklace grew warm against her chest as she prepared to begin the lesson, its connection to WíyakA's essence allowing her to draw upon her great-great-grandmother's accumulated wisdom whenever guidance was needed for the challenges that arose in her role as teacher and protector. The pendant served as more than a mere keepsake. It was a communication device that maintained the spiritual connection between generations of women who had dedicated their lives to preserving the sacred balance. Tell them about the eagle who loved them so much that she gave up her own life to ensure their safety. WíyakA's voice whispered through the pendant, as clear and loving as it had been on the day of her ultimate sacrifice. Help them understand that true strength comes not from the power to dominate others, but from the willingness to serve something greater than personal comfort or ambition. As Wynona began to speak to the children about the lessons that could be learned from observing the natural world and listening to the wisdom of their elders, she felt the deep satisfaction that comes from a life lived in accordance with one's truest purpose. The terrified 8-year-old who had bid on an eagle at auction had grown into a confident young woman whose influence extended throughout the territory and whose teachings would shape the character of generations yet to be born. The sacred mountain rose behind them, its peaks crowned with the shimmer of spiritual protection that would endure long after everyone present had passed into the realm of ancestors and memory. The barrier that WíyakA had created with her sacrifice served not just as a shield against those who would harm sacred places, but as a beacon of hope that reminded all who saw it that love could indeed triumph over hatred, wisdom over ignorance, and cooperation over the destructive competition that had once threatened to tear their world apart. As the sun set over the valley where so many crucial events had unfolded, Wynona felt WíyakA's presence surrounding her like warm wings, protecting and guiding her as she continued the work that her great-great-grandmother had begun over a century earlier. The little Apache girl had found her destiny in saving an eagle, but the true miracle lay in discovering that saving others had ultimately saved herself, transforming her into a guardian whose influence would ripple through time like sunlight dancing on water, creating beauty and hope wherever it touched the lives of those who still believed in the possibility of a world where all beings could live together in harmony and mutual respect. The eagle spirit lived on in every act of compassion, every moment of understanding between cultures, and every child who learned that their greatest power lay not in taking from others, but in giving of themselves to serve the sacred balance that connected all life in an endless web of love and responsibility.